Justin and Julie, good evening. Doctors say it's one of the rarest forms of heart defects in young adults. And if not detected, it can be deadly. It can happen in young athletes without any previous conditions and who from the outside may appear perfectly healthy. Doctors say sudden cardiac death is the #1 cause of death in the United States and Western Europe. They describe it as death that occurs usually 24 hours after the onset of symptoms in people under 50 years old. Most of these deaths happen in adults who have already had some cardiac problem, but there are a small percentage of people who don't have any previous conditions, including young athletes.
It's a very difficult problem. First of all, the number of athletes who die suddenly is pretty small. For instance, in terms of high school, it's estimated maybe 1 in 200,000. However, it always has a significant impact because they are athletes, they are supposed to be healthy, and we look at them as something that should not happen to them.
Dr. Teixeira says the most important point to emphasize is that the likelihood of dying during an athletic event is very small, but it does happen. He says the question is, what can be done to prevent it?
And there are not a lot we can do, but there are some things we can do. Number one, if you have a history of sudden cardiac death in your family, parents or uncles or cousins, you really should not engage into sports without going to a doctor and have them screen you to see if in fact it's safe or not.
He says people also need to be aware of any history of fainting, blackout spells, or seizures. They can all lead to a cardiac event, so instances like these are not to be ignored.
Because a lot of this is hereditary. So they don't know they had the condition, and they were born with, in case of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, really a change in the heart muscle which is abnormal and may not manifest until the teenage years.
An echocardiogram, the screening needed to check for this problem, can cost up to $1,000, so schools can only do so much.
We do carry an AED, automatic defibrillator with us. We have them on the sidelines to use if that ever is needed. And other than that, you can only do so much cardiac screenings.
Dr. Teixeira says it's not only a pricey investment to do all of these cardiac screenings, but so few of them may come back positive.
The difficulty is, because it's rare, we'll have to screen a lot of people to identify very few.
But he says although it's rare, it can still happen. That's why all schools are required to have an automatic defibrillator on the field, and coaches and staff should know how to use it.
If you can defibrillate these people in the first 3 minutes, once they collapse, and sooner the better, the likelihood of saving some of these young athletes is much higher.
And Justin and Julie, I just want to emphasize again, this is a hereditary problem. So if you have any history of cardiac death in your family, seeing a doctor for a screening could save your life. Good evening, Justin and Julie. Concussions have had a lot of buzz this past year. People wanting to know more and more about just how serious they can be. One doctor here in Rapid City is trying to spread the word. Dr. Christopher Dietrich of the Rehab Doctors also serves as the medical director for the Rapid City Rush and knows how damaging a concussion can be. They can impact the future of both their career as an athlete and everyday life.
Concussions are very common, and one of the current understandings is that they're probably underreported.
Signs and symptoms of a concussion can vary and increase over time. Dr. Dietrich says a concussion is also not always visually apparent.
The outward signs, you can't always see somebody and tell if they've had a concussion.
Concussions, major and minor, can cause headaches, dizziness, nausea, fatigue, sadness, and attention problems. And Dr. Dietrich says even with those symptoms, over 50% go undiagnosed.
That a lot of minor concussions happen at practices. Kids have contact, they are dizzy, they're lightheaded, but they don't necessarily tell their parents or their coach.
He says many athletes have a different way of getting up after a tackle or hit after a concussion. He says sometimes they'll run to the wrong sideline or huddle. And research has shown that age can be a factor in recovery. Young athletes may recover more slowly and are more easily concussed.
The long-term consequences are not completely known, but what we do know is that concussions are cumulative. And so every time you get your bell rung, every time you have a concussion, the effects add up over time. And how many is safe, we don't really know, but we want to try to protect individuals so that these kids, when they graduate from high school, they go on to college, they go on to their future employment and careers.
Stevens head football coach Paul Ferdinand says they sometimes hit a stretch of games where they have a player get concussed, and other times they'll go several weeks without one. But he says he always reminds the player that he has to remove from the game, your future's more important than a W.
I tell him that, football is important, but you're more important than the game. I mean, your livelihood, you being a positive adult when you get older is more important to me than winning the football game.
Coaches and athletic trainers say when it comes to equipment, the schools have the best of the best. But with one strong hit, a helmet can only protect so much.
Helmets are mostly there to prevent fractures and skull injuries. And the brain still, for lack of a better term, sloshes around or moves around within the helmet on these sudden stops and starts and hits.
And for the most part, the coaches and athletic trainers say these boys know what they're getting into when they play football. They know the sudden impact that can occur.
It is a contact sport, and everybody going into football realizes that, and they understand the risk of playing contact sports, not only football, but like a hockey or wrestling and so forth. Going into it, and they know it, then it's easier for them to grasp the different injuries that do come up.
And Dr. Dietrich says he's seen some athletes who've had 4 to 6 concussions over their lifetime. Tomorrow night, we'll show you just how he's joined forces with local high schools to prevent numbers like this from happening in the future. Good evening, Justin and Julie. The program was started just this year in Rapid City, but it originated at the University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine. It's become the standard of care in concussion management, and it's used nationally in professional football, baseball, hockey, and soccer. Hits like these are frequently seen at high school and National League football games. 63% of all concussions occur in football. And now doctors are starting to look more into these hits and what they mean for the athlete's future. Dr. Christopher Dietrich of the Rehab Doctors says it's imperative for a player to be removed from the game after a suspected concussion. He says the risk of a second hit is too great.
Once you have a minor concussion, even a small concussion, your brain cells are injured, they're shocked, they're not functioning appropriately, and a second hit or a second concussion with that scenario can create massive swelling, brain edema that can lead to brain damage or even death in some instances.
Dr. Dietrich says statistics show each season up to 20% of football players may sustain a concussion. This year, 4 local high schools are implementing a new program to manage them. It's called the Rapid City Concussion Program.
The group of individuals that are involved in Rapid, myself, Black Hills Orthopedics, the athletic trainers from Black Hills Orthopedics, in covering sporting events, recognize that there's a need in the community for a more structured concussion management program. And through these discussions, we decided that one of the best ways that we could implement this at the high school level would be to use the impact concussion testing, essentially the same type of testing and screenings that we use with the CHL or the Rush hockey team in town.
Schools involved are Stevens, Central, St. Thomas More, and Sturgis High Schools. Before the season, students take a computerized test, checking memory, processing, speed, and reaction times, all things that measure how the brain functions.
Each individual would get a score, which is their baseline score, that we keep in a database. Then if that individual undergoes a concussion or an injury during the course of the year, we follow the concussion guidelines, which say we wait for their headaches, their nausea, their blurred vision to clear. Once they're starting to feel normal, we then assess how they're functioning from a brain standpoint and repeat the impact concussion test.
Okay. Their score on the repeat test is compared to their baseline score. Once the athlete's back to their original score, they're cleared for some activity and then eventually full contact. All the coaches say so far the program has been nothing but positive.
Sometimes you'll ask a kid, or you'll think a kid is, and yet he's not. I mean, he's just, he's dehydrated or something like that. He's not actually concussed. And so it takes some of the responsibility out of as a coach, because you worry about every player's safety. You want them to be, football is important, but it's not the most important thing.
Definitely something that has huge implications for our local high school students. I mean, these are injuries that I think are getting a lot of national press, but also some local press as far as what the effects of concussion do to an individual over time. And I think the more evidence that we are obtaining medically shows that these are cumulative effects, that every little bell ring and minor concussion adds up over the course of an individual's athletic career or lifetime.
And Coach Ferdinand says he and his staff also teach players proper techniques on the field to prevent head injuries. If you're interested in learning more about the Rapid City Concussion Program, you can check out their Facebook page. Justin, back to you.